Thank you very much, folks, for coming along on this cold, cold night, not yet rainy. Touch wood, you know. Yes, I'm very, very pleased to be back here at the Eureka Centre. The last time I was here for any time was that fabulous exhibition, Bling. Did many of you go to it? Yeah, lots. So you've seen the real thing, which is pretty eye-smashing, isn't it? It's one of my favourite things to talk about. So here we go. One of the most fundamental things about gold rushes and gold digging and gold finding was that it literally increased the money supply in the world. It made extra money, and state or colonial governments, rather, cashed in on this via taxes and charges and so forth, which is how come the colony of Victoria had such a lot of excellent money in the slightly longer run than the early 1850s to build schools and institutions like hospitals and libraries and museums. Victoria was really civilised thanks to gold, thanks to people who could, if they were lucky, dig it up. So, question, what did lucky diggers actually do with their gold? Well, as always, S.T. Gill gives us some answers. And he drew this pair, the provident diggers and improvident diggers. It's so true today. The provident diggers bought land. Look at them in their modest digger clothes, their Crimea shirts and their old felt hats, looking at development, land developments. They would have been smart if they'd bought in 1853 when this picture was made. Improvident diggers were the kind who went out to spend their hard-gotten gains. They dressed up, flash, and they spent it on exotic, expensive things like the contents of the jeweller's shop. They bought jewellery, among other things. They bought jewellery for themselves, men who were proud to be diggers. I thought this picture, this slice from the Eugene von Gerard painting that's called "I Have Got It," is a very satisfied digger. Yes, I've got it wrong. Anyway, he is a proud, confident digger, and maybe he got all that gold in his pan. Let's hope he did. And if he did if he took it to a local jeweller, there were some here, there were more in Geelong and even more in Melbourne. And a flash digger could spend his money on masculine jewellery like a watch chain. A watch chain made of nuggets was a particularly fine sight. In this Gill picture, you can see one being worn from his clipped into his shirt buttonhole and around to the pocket in his he's wearing his digger's shirt, but it's obviously a nice one tucked in. He's flaunting his gold, whether it was big links or whether it was actually made of nuggets. And often a watch chain had a fob dangling from it, which usually, if it went from watch pocket to the other pocket where you could tuck in the chain, you'd wear a fob that would just dangle very, very nicely against your tummy. And if it was a lump of gold as big as that one, you could feel pretty satisfied. Another item of jewellery that diggers were infamous for was big gold rings. And I think we can just make out on this digger's hand there are several big colonial rings like the one illustrated. In fact, when the Prince of Wales came here in 1868, 9, 7, he acquired quite a number of big gold rings, and he was described by one of the people in his travelling party as he had so many on his fingers that it was more like a solid fin than a hand. The Prince of Wales did quite well. No, not the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Edinburgh. He did quite well out of his trip to the Goldfields. They might also buy jewellery for their women. There was a certain amount of jewellery designed and made right here in the colony, like this very nice bracelet, which is in the National Gallery of Victoria now, but wouldn't be out of place in London or, for that matter, New York. And there are plenty of other jewellery, as suggested from the goods in the window of the jeweller here. Or, yes, it's supposed to come up. Or you could buy jewellery to celebrate Diggerdom. You know that word? The land of diggers, the kingdom of diggers, Diggerdom. This is just such a wonderful literal expression of the success or the luck of gold digging. It's literally, a gold, 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 as the Olympic commentators shriek when someone gets a medal. The thing is, it's a very peculiar form of jewellery. It does have some conventional elements, mainly the framework of decorative leaves. Sometimes there are bunches of grapes or tendrils. Sometimes they're more classical acanthus leaves, but they're just a decorative frame, a long tradition of framing feature objects in wreaths of plants. These brooches are in it. What's peculiar is the middle, the labourer, the digger, the gold digger himself at work, winding a windlass to draw the bucket amazingly full of gold nuggets, right up out of the hill, out of the hole, and the further tools needed to process it. Spade, pick and shovel, gold pan, the cradle, next to it a tub for water. Oh, no, it's not a tub, it's actually a scoop, a tub on a stick for ladling water into the cradle. Not sure what that pan or tub or bucket is over on the right-hand side, but I expect you needed plenty of them if you were sluicing away. And then at the top, this odd little bag is a little leather pouch in which you pop your gold dust or preferably your nuggets. And on the other side, a pistol to defend what you've got. Now, something that I'd be interested in your thoughts about is this landscape of hills, mountains behind. I wondered if we can see them as volcanic hills, but is the volcanic country, does it come all the way up here into the goldfields? Oh, it does. So that may well be literally the local, or an element of the local landscape. They're not just your average round rolling hills, they're those wonderful volcanic ones. This brooch is unmarked, so we don't know anything about it. But I think we can be pretty sure that it's, well, A, it's Australian, B, it's Victorian and perhaps Eastern Goldfields. Here are a couple more on the same lines. That first one is very big, it's huge. But these ones are pretty big too, They're this sort of wide, sometimes even wider. They go down to about 4 centimetres, so they're still a solid lump of gold. You get the idea, the wreath of leaves, sometimes with tools and emblematic items in among them, and framing a worker, a funny little stick figure. We're talking about stick figures that are less than a centimetre tall here. So they're not really smart sculptured things. They're almost a bit amateur. In fact, neither of these, the upper and bigger one, are really great compositions from an artistic point of view. And the little stick figure in the one with the wonderful blue drapery, he's really in the stick figure class, isn't he? But wow, it's such a statement. I got gold. I got it, as Eugene von Gerard's man said. And I found a name for these big brooches. This is one of the ballads written and published in 1859. I take it it's an original composition, no traditional sort of thing. And I was just thrilled to come across S.T. Gill illustrating it again in Counter Attractions at the Royal. Here they are, numbers of admirers hanging around the bar, all of them trying to be in the first item of her attention. One gives her a great digger brooch. Okay, great digger brooch. Others, lockets. We all know what a locket is. Pencil cases, meaning the little decorative cases for a pencil that you might keep on your belt or in your pocket, usually in silver, but in Ballarat they made them of gold. Big colonial rings. This is just a selection of 1850s rings. They're not super valuable, precious things, other than that they're made of real gold, but they are the sort of pretty expensive gifts that a lonely man might give to a charming young woman. So there, I think we've found the name of a big colonial. Not big colonial rings, a great digger brooch, Well, you would know well about the greatest flash colonial barmaid. This brooch is the most splendiferous digger brooch which is yet known, presented to the greatest flash colonial barmaid in the colonies. It's inscribed on the back of the shield, presented Melbourne, December 28, 1855, to Madame Lola Montez by her friends in Victoria as proof of their esteem. Now, you've doubtless heard the stories that Lola, the exotic dancer, was often showered with with nuggets thrown by admirers. And she took home to California when she went in 1856-7. She took a number of apparently huge nuggets and huge pieces of jewellery because someone else found an auction note for a little town in California. We're not even talking about San Francisco. Of sale of massive gold jewellery and nuggets. She was using the gold jewellery, as women often have traditionally, as an emergency reserve of wealth. It might be heartbreaking to melt down some gold jewellery, but perhaps not many people were so thrilled with this that they wouldn't rather swap it for the cash. And Lola needed it by that time. Here's a few more. We're still talking big brooches, though these are getting smaller. Only 4 centimetres. But you get the picture very quickly, don't you? The wreath surrounding a symbolic sort of arrangement of a worker or the tools of labour. This one on the left always strikes me as a bit odd because he's wearing very loose pants which are workers' pants, but it makes him look like a Chinese figure in my eye. It always just rings wrong. But he's holding up teeny-weeny nuggets, which, of course, in comparison to his scale, look enormous. It's a great statement. And then, of course, you throw in another nugget dangling from the bottom. Eh? Over the top is never too much. The whole notion of a wreath of leaves surrounding the brooch survives, but the tools, the implements of labour, get more basic. Some of them are really pretty clumsy. This development on the right-hand side of having rustic twigs instead of traditional opulent leaves is an interesting version. There aren't many of them, but obviously someone had the bright idea that he wanted to design a different looking gold digger brooch. And so went for the leafless look. Maybe it was winter time. What I want to point out here is how this sketch, which depicts exactly the kind of work that the tiny digger figures are depicted as doing in the gold brooches, is surmounted by this almost heraldic arrangement of tools. It's not just the digger tools, though they're right at the top. They're the apex of the digger's life laid out in a symbolic sort of way. The cooking goods. Over on the right-hand side, that big shapeless lump is a leg of beef. And sometimes you'll see some of the big digger brooches have a leg of beef, or maybe it's mutton, on them too. Very expressive of the basics of digger life, isn't it? You can see in this sketch by Tulloch just how, in a very mid-Victorian way, he's arranging tools, the tools of gold digging labour, in a grand heraldic way, as if they were armour in a trophy that's carved on a monumental arch. It has ancient Roman origins and very 18th century English as well. In fact, I think that the arrangement of tools like this in heraldic format is a bit of a satire, or at least a takeoff of the grandeur of more august efforts like war or conquest or a battle won. This heraldic styling of the pick and the shovel and other tools was used over and over again depicting the Victorian goldfields. I call it a satire because the massed implements of gold digging are the most basic tools in the world of hard manual labour, which was the lot in the real world of the lowly working class in British society. But in the colonial case, the diggers could as easily be respectable middle class, even upper class men, thrown into the work of common labourers. It was one of the often noted absurdities of Goldfields' worlds. But it was a more noble effort because it produced the most desirable thing in the world, namely gold. So the glorification of the pick and shovel, like the lovely Mary Fortune's wonderful, rousing doggerel verse, generated assertive words and pictures which represented and represent a very disturbing challenge to respectable society. But from today's standpoint, these images and words are important sources of the famous Australian digger ethic of equality of men and loyalty of mates working together, and the sheer virtue of manual labour. The possibility of getting rich by good luck and manual labour, but the myth had it as good luck, that actually subverted the capitalist ethic of disciplined labour. It seemed ready to undermine the social fabric of British settler society in the colonies. I'm sure you've all read those shocked comments. My God, people who can just get lucky and become rich and flaunt their wealth. The world is coming to an end. Besides celebrating the labour of the digger, there was another dimension of Goldfields jewellery that emerged at the same time, this time inspired by the special characteristics of Australia. The land of gold was inhabited by strange animals, trees, flowers, and native people. So, using much the same brooch framework, a wreath of leaves, sometimes reduced to just a ring, a textured ring, jewellers began to incorporate kangaroos and emus and tree ferns and grass trees and banksias, and occasionally figures of Aboriginal people. Can you see that in the middle brooch? It's an awkward brooch to photograph. And in fact, it's the only one I'm aware of which has an Aboriginal figure in it, which is interesting given that by the mid-50s, I believe there were the kinds of ornaments and trophies that had, usually in silver, that had worked figures of Aboriginal people standing at the base of the trophy, the cup, the table ornament. It's curious that the Aboriginal figure doesn't turn up much in gold digger jewellery. I hope you can see that in the one on the left, there is native flora. I think that's a hakea on the left, though glad to hear other opinions. A banksia on the right, some bulrushes on the top. On the bottom, there are lily-type leaves and a goanna. The brooch on the far right is, I think, one of the most beautiful by one of the best company of jewellers based in Sydney, actually, who were producing this stuff. Again, the hakeas, banksias, ferns, other leaves, and a little piece of quartz with a gold vein in it. Very subtle reminder about what this is. You can just see it being sent home to mother as a lovely trophy of her offspring's success in Australia. Interesting question. Who made the digger jewellery? They were made in Australia and only in Australia by immigrant people who had the skills of jeweller, whether or not they were gold workers as well. People who may have come here inspired by the gold rushes, the lure of the gold rushes, but who might have decided it was more worthwhile returning to their trade as they could make a good living as gold dealers and retailers and makers. And interestingly, we can see that in that top slice of an St. Gill picture on the far left. Go to the gold office where we buy gold, Mark's Jeweller. That's not a real name, by the way. There's the shop window, the retail front, and on the right, which seems to be over the door that goes into the jeweller, a pawnbroking ball, 3 balls as well. So the jeweller, the goldsmith, is a person who deals with wealth. They also commonly dealt with spectacles and other scientific instruments like telescopes and barometers, and they dealt in watches. Watches were almost always imported. You could always engrave something local on them. And for that matter, so were spectacles and telescopes. And manufactured jewellery. It's really important to know that the stock of the jewellers' shops, the colonial jewellers' shops, was probably the largest part imports. Sometimes it's from jewellery companies that the goldsmiths had worked with in England, usually, sometimes Germany. Sometimes they just established commercial links and were sent a load of stuff to sell to the eager, too rich people. The trades of jeweller and watchmaker involved small precision tools, as they still do for the handful who actually do handwork. And they were usefully portable. This is the reason why a significant number of emigrant jewellers, which is a term I'll use to refer to the group of maker traders, a significant proportion of them were Jewish, especially among Central Europeans, where Jews had regularly been subject to pogroms and persecution. And in fact, some who came here were actually already refugees in London before they heard about gold in Australia and picked up gold fever there. The small note just visible in this ring are some pseudo hallmarks. There was no legal system to control the purity of gold in jewellery, but of course consumers knew that hallmarks were the traditional thing to guarantee gold, and silver likewise. So some jewellers invented their own. It wasn't until the 1880s that system began, I think began in Victoria, not surprisingly, and it wasn't until early in the 20th century that there was a national gold marking scheme. But these are some of the few ways in which we can identify actual jewellers. We can see some 30 jewellers working on the Australian goldfields, but we know many more names than we can be certain to attribute certain items to. And I just thought it's useful to throw in the possibly connecting feature of Masonic jewellery, which was one of the major things that local jewellers made. Usually they would just inscribe some local words on a pre-manufactured piece, but they also made Masonic jewels, like this fabulous one with the half wreaths of Scottish thistles, which was presented to a past Grand Master, what have you. And you see that it wasn't uncommon, or it wasn't unknown for jewellers to cut out tiny little tools and arrange them in heraldic sort of ways. Look, before I do that, I'll just go back to my notes. Yes, hallmarks. All of this points to the reality that digger jewellery was a small sideline of the regular business in more fashionable men's and women's jewellery and watches and spectacles, the stuff that was imported. The fashionable retail goods were imported from manufacturing jewellers, mainly in Britain, It's likely that Masonic ceremonial medals were the most frequent craftsman pieces made in the colonies. By contrast, making original new jewels from local gold was a bravura showpiece work of the trade. It was a shop window spectacle that boosted the colony's golden image, a response to gold digger demand for something very special. These jewellers probably made many more common fashionable style jewels, but unless they added an identifiable mark, we don't know that they weren't simply imported. This stresses further that digger jewellery, identified by nuggets and kangaroos, was a small subset of Goldfields makers' work. It gained significance again in the 1970s, 80s, the first decade of Australian centenaries and bicentenaries, which began a new surge of cultural nationalism that many of us were aware of. It's when the term Australiana really emerged. Australians began to be interested in and became positively proud of material culture representing the history and environment of white Australia. Always having been fairly uncommon also makes the digger jewels more collectible and valuable today than conventional Victorian era jewellery. Collectors are now into Australian jewellery, and especially Goldfield jewellery, in a big way, and the sale prices just go up and up. I'm not au fait with the prices. I just hear about them every now and again, and it's like real estate. You think, my God, what? Let's look at another facet of digger jewellery. Who wore it? How would you feel if your best beloved either sent you or gave to you direct a pick and shovel type brooch? Well, gee, thanks. That's lovely. It's a lovely piece of gold. But surely you'd think most women would have preferred the sentimental gesture of a nice piece of decorative jewellery. There's little direct evidence in Australian pictures or writing. There are a handful of daguerreotypes. These ones, I have to confess, are all foreign, both English and American. And I have them here to just remind you how brooches were worn in the mid-century, which is at the throat or sometimes a bit lower on the breast. In later times, in the 1890s, when another form of gold digger brooches was produced, they were worn on high necklines, and so they tended to be more horizontal than sort of round. It's very hard, of course, to identify on a daguerreotype whether an item of jewellery might be a genuine gold digger type. But sometimes, I know about 3 photos where I can be really confident. As a rule, we can only say that digger jewellery was worn by women with connections to a gold digger. A brooch was the most common form of jewellery, aside from rings. Bracelets and earrings come next, and there are some fabulous gold digger bracelets, which I decided I didn't have time to put in. Nuggets, animals, the whole caboodle. Necklaces are very rare at this time, at least among people who didn't often go out to balls and wear evening dresses, because a necklace demands a beautiful exposed neck, and of course Victorian day dress, or even polite, or night dress. If you weren't in the class of having dramatic evening clothes, then you really didn't have a place or a time to wear necklaces. So people did have long gold chains, which often carried a watch or a little chatelaine of decorative things. But neck pieces are not so common in the mid-19th century as ordinary jewellery. Almost all women depended on men for their jewellery. Legally, of course, wives were still the property of their husbands, along with their children and usually anything they owned before marriage. For men who were rich enough to give golden jewels to their women, the act was perhaps, one hopes, partly one of love and gratitude, but it was also a public demonstration of a man's own wealth, equally reflective on a husband as his other possessions, like horses and carriages and fine house, a decorative woman wearing gold. Still, to be blunt, gold jewellery has always and everywhere served as a store of reserved wealth, which women find they can control in difficult circumstances. And that was Lola Montez's case when she auctioned off her colonial Victorian nuggets and brooches. So this is the kind of thing that 1850s, 60s woman might have fancied rather than a gold digger brooch. These are mainly lower end jewels. The two on the furthest left are perhaps the nicest pieces, the best designed, the most solid, the most definitely gold. The one on the right, for instance, looks pretty brassy to me, though it's quite an elaborate form. And you do have to remember that paste jewels or glass jewels, gems, imitation gems, were entirely common. Something that we can see in this small collection, in the big central cameo and that white cameo to its right, is the framework with or without leaves, which is carried over into the design of the digger brooches. These are fairly cheap. They may be low carat gold. They may in fact be brass or the stuff that's called yellow metal. And there's plenty of it. Yes. My research suggests that the pick and shovel jewellery, digger jewellery, really is an Australian original, and quite likely in Ballarat. The handful of big decorative brooches like this one, which is now in the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney, there are reasons to think that a couple of them are engraved. One says Ballarat, one is engraved Victoria. The Lola Montez one is engraved Victoria. The examples that we know which have a Sydney provenance tend to be the smaller ones. But look, when I started this research, no one had seen the big gold digger jewels. I saw my first one in the hands of a dealer in Perth in 1984. And since then, more and more have emerged because a market demand has appeared among collectors of historic jewellery and Australian jewellery. So now when they pop up in foreign parts, dealers are in contact with others, and they come to the most valuable marketplace for Australian jewellery, which is right here. I reckon that now that we know of about 20 big, great digger brooches, there are only a few in public collections, but I'm optimistic that more will come. There are many more smaller digger brooches than I had any expectation of from this period. So, you start researching and things turn up. Look, I'll leave that. If you want to read any more, one way is just Google Linda Young and subversive jewellery and you'll find some things. Or, of course, there's that excellent bling catalogue. Look, can I go for another 15 minutes? Or would you rather talk?
Probably we could have more talking and less questions. You want to take a look at that?
Great. I can tell you a bit more of the whole spectrum of digger jewellery. Look, when I began, I thought, well, look, the design must have come from California, the first great international gold rush, 1848-49. It was actually a very short-lived big gold rush, though, gold continues to be found there. And so for all this time, I have been on the lookout for Californian pieces. I ask people who are interested. I've been to antique jewellery shops in the US and museums. They don't know of anything like the Australian digger brooches. At the same time, this is a Californian daguerreotype of a 49er, 1849er, and he's got his nugget and he's got his pick and shovel, but he's not holding them he's not arranging them in a definitely heraldic form. There are quite a lot of these, but I've never seen an Australian picture of a digger dressed in digger clothes holding tools. If you ever find one, I'll love to hear about it. California then was the first big international gold rush. Victoria and New South Wales was the next in the 1850s and 60s. And of course, in both places, gold continues to be mined, but the big international rushes were in these decades. And further finds were made in Queensland, Northern Territory, around into upper northwest corner of West Australia, down at last into the eastern goldfields of Western Australia in the 1890s. This is where I started my pick and shovel journey. These are pictures from Coolgardie, and you'll notice that brooch. I hope it's clear enough. There's a bar brooch, which is the fashionable form for the 90s, worn on a high collar. A windlass with a bucket that drops through a little golden hole. Oh, that one doesn't seem to have its bucket. It's lost its bucket. But often there is. And some of them have this arch of cut-out letters with the name of the goldfield, Coolgardie, Kalgoorlie, whatever. They're very, very collectible. They're everyone's favourite in Australia because the big Victorian ones are really super, super scarce. These are just reasonably scarce. The next picture is one of the Murchison Goldfields, and it shows the typical bar brooch with a nugget. There's heaps of them, and there's nothing like a nugget to say I have got it. The little cross pick and shovel, still in that sort of elongated horizontal format, is the one that has become really typical of West Australian brooches. Crossed with a nugget at the crossing. Sometimes there's a bucket or a nugget dangling from it. Something that's peculiar is that in the West, in the goldfields, where they didn't have water to separate out the heavier gold grains, they separated it out from the dirt with air. This guy is working a bellows and up to a shaker screen, and its name has disappeared from my poor mind at the moment. But I've never found a West Australian brooch, which has this particular machine on it, and it's a mystery. On the other hand, if you look at the little brooch in the middle right-hand side, it's called Abbott's, which is a mine in the Murchison too. It's got a stamper battery, which is what that technical drawing is, a stamper battery. It's pretty weird. If they could put a stamper battery on a brooch, I don't know why we don't have a dry blower. That's what it's called, a dry blower. There it is. Now, these brooches all date from the 1890s. The rushes there began in 1894 at Coolgardie, though there were earlier ones. No jewellery there, but 1890s, 90s. In the later 90s and then the 20th century, we get an influx of this other version of pick and shovel. The critical difference is that here the shovel blade and head are at the same end. They're crossed like that, rather than like that. Don't you love this picture of the diggers sitting proudly beside their nuggets? And they themselves arrange their tools in that heraldic way, with a water bag as well. Good point in Western Australia. Now, there are a lot of these. Some are, they've been studied very minutely by a jewellery historian in the West named Dorothy Erickson, who knows far more about these than I, and even she can't tell for sure whether they're definitely West Australian, because they go on to have a further history. But I've come to suspect that while some are locally made, and occasionally there are markings on them, some are mass-produced, quite probably in Manchester or London. They're pretty cute. The water gets muddied around the puddle of these cross pick and shovel brooches, because you find some where the blade of the shovel is marked, it's just stamped South Africa. It's clear mass production type techniques. And the mining history of South Africa is really complex, and it gets worse. It gets worse with the British Empire making war on the South African Republic of the Boers. They found diamonds in the British Empire's part, the Cape Colony in the Kimberley. It's in the 1870s. Diamonds have to be mined deep by massive labour. So there isn't much of a rush of international workers. I don't know if they actually enslaved local Africans, but I believe it was local Africans who were the major labourers. Then in the Transvaal, the South African Republic, which sort of coexisted with the British colony of the second half of the 19th century, they found gold, which turned out to be very serious international gold rush, inducing gold from the late 1880s. And this was so attractive that the British Empire decided, we can't have these Boers enjoying this gold. We're going to have to make war on them. Now, they did, and take them over. They did have two wars. The First Boer War was in the 1880s, and I can't remember when now, presumably the later ones. And the Boers won because they were great bush warriors. In the Second War, the British were much more ruthless, and after 3 years, they won that war at great cost. They took over the Boer colonies. The Boer colonies had, or settlements, had called themselves a republic, the South African Republic, for some years. This gets a bit lost. Here are some obviously South African brooches. The reason we can tell they're not West Australian is that they're stamped South Africa. But interestingly, we don't get well, it's very rare to find a shovel blade that's stamped Australia or Western Australia, though there are some occasionally that look like, just have the feel of being later, that are stamped Ballarat, but they're not 1850s, they're 1890s or indeed early 1900s. Sometimes the presence of a diamond or a pseudo-diamond suggests South Africa. Another giveaway is a golden Kruger pound. That was the currency that was introduced by in the Republic, the Boer Republic, in the 1880s. Yeah, in the earliest rush, there was international rush, but as you can see, African people were involved as well. And very quickly, particularly after the Brits won the Second World War, mining became an African workforce who, as they still do, I understand, move in and then go home for a period, come back in to work in the mines and then go back home. Now, in this situation, those people aren't buying gold brooches. And it's my belief, though I have yet to find any definite proof, that the South African gold brooches of the early 20th century became much more sort of tourist souvenirs. The last big international rush was to Yukon in Canada and Alaska, the USA. The dividing line down the middle. The first discoveries were just on the Canadian side. You had these hideous trips to get there. You've probably seen that famous picture of a great snowy mountain and a line of little ants going up it, carrying picks and shovels to get there. But that happened right way down at Skagway and Chilkoot Pass. They had a hell of a long way to get. It was just a ghastly place. And there were more and more discoveries, but they were never as big, the fields of Fairbanks and Nome and shorter. But there is some Canadian and Alaskan jewellery. It has maple leaves on it. So we can be sure about that. This little tiny nuggets arranged over an existing sort of a ring or a watch or a brooch shape seems to me now the characteristic of Alaskan or Yukon jewellery. When I was looking for digger jewellery in Perth in the 80s, I came across a few of these because, of course, diggers were an international lot, and some of their souvenirs from Alaska and Yukon came back home. There were subsequent huge rushes, really big rushes in Colorado, Nevada, Idaho. That's inland from California, but still in those Rocky Mountains or other mountains. Immense gold. Nevada is still a huge, huge producer of gold. And this form of digger brooch turns up. Cross pick and shovel with the tool heads at opposite ends, which is the West Australian feature, but they're sort of more delicate and more attenuated. They have that standard gold pan with various things in it, and sometimes it includes a banner with a name like Yukon or Nevada or some such. Now, I have traced that motif to the mad American fad of the 1890s for silver collectible spoons. Just look at that first spoon with its pan and cross pick and shovel. Because this was a huge production industry, making new spoons, silver spoons to be collected, I reckon there were designers in the USA just churning them out, and they used the gold pans as a gold symbol on plenty of other silver spoons as well. And I suspect that as an 1890s, 1910s, 1920s thing is where this type of brooch fits. And just to end, I was fascinated to find that diagram today. China has only just become the largest producer, and South Africa has recently gone down drastically because of, I think they said no investment. Sounds crazy. South Africa was the biggest producer for decades. Interesting, eh? Thank you so much for listening to all that.